So while we are all waiting for Starship SN9 to do the high-altitude test flight, NASA's SLS Green Run hotfire test encountered a serious problem, namely a premature engine shutdown.
In this episode, we want to think about what this could mean for the future of the SLS rocket, think about some different scenarios, and then what implications we might see long-term for the future of NASA's Artemis program, which intends to bring back humans to the surface of the moon. And maybe if even Starship could land on the moon first. And we'll try our best even not to rant about SLS, okay? Promised. So stay tuned.
So while we are all waiting for Starship SN9 to resume static fire testing, after 2 of its 3 Raptor engines have to be switched out after receiving some light damage in the last round of static fire testing, we have another rocket that also did some testing. Of course, we are talking about the Green Run hotfire test of the SLS rocket on Saturday, January 16th at the Stennis Space Center. This test goes further than a standard static fire test. In this test, the engines simulate a complete launch event, meaning that they fire for the full duration of how long a real launch would take, until the fuel tanks are depleted. All this, of course, while the rocket is pinned down. So on Saturday, 5:30 p.m. ET, all 4 Aerojet Rocketdyne RS-25 engines ignited for the first time in an SLS rocket, creating a very impressive exhaust cloud, the exhaust having been deflected sideways after exiting the RS-25 engines. So this test was intended to last 8 minutes and 5 seconds. Although according to Boeing, the prime contractor for SLS, 250 seconds would have been enough to gather the most relevant data. However, the hotfire test unfortunately only lasted 1 minute, and then suddenly the engines shut down far too early. So what exactly had happened? Apparently, as some chatter from the control room indicated, there was a major component failure on engine 4. Wayne Hale, a former NASA shuttle flight director, tweeted that this doesn't sound really good, as a major component failure isn't something you usually want to hear during such a test.
So apparently RS-25 engine 4 suffered a major component failure, forcing the engine controller to shut down all the engines. What does SSME stand for? Space Shuttle Main Engine. Yes, the SLS doesn't only use the same RS-25 main engines from the Space Shuttle, but also the same engine controller. What exactly happened to engine 4 isn't entirely clear yet, but a bright flash was detected at the interface of the thermal protection blanket of engine 4. Now in the aftermath, according to spacepolicyonline.com, Jim Bridenstine, of course, tried to do some damage control, saying, quote, "We've got to remember what we're doing here. We are testing hardware, and when you test, you learn things," end quote. And so, okay, SLS suffered a minor setback, so let's continue with the hotfire testing next week. Wait, this is not Starship we're talking here, where you can just swap a faulty engine for a new one and continue static firing next week. The thing with the SLS RS-25 engine is that even should this turn out to be a minor problem which can be fixed relatively easily, a repeat of this test is probably a month away, because the engines need to dry out for at least 20 or even up to 30 days. However, should the engineers from NASA, Boeing and Aerojet Rocketdyne, who are now all jointly working together to find out the problem, find out that fixing will take longer than anticipated because it turns out to be a major component problem of the engine, then this will of course lead to much longer delays. But even in the best case scenario, this means that the test can be repeated next month in February earliest.
However, the SLS core stage of the entire SLS rocket that was being tested here is the same one intended to launch on the Artemis 1 mission in November this year. In order to meet that deadline, the core stage must leave Stennis Space Center towards Kennedy Space Center in February. This in turn means that the next hotfire test has to be successful if Artemis 1 should launch in November. So there's a very big chance that Artemis 1 will get postponed now. And please subscribe to our channel, because we really need your support in order to continue openly talking about the politics in the spaceflight industry. And we might make a real difference together. So thanks a lot in advance. And you might remember that SLS was actually intended to have its maiden flight already in 2017. Then the maiden flight got postponed to 2018, then 2019, then 2020, and lastly now to November 2021. Another delay would push the launch well into 2022. Then of course the big question arises: how many more delays can the Artemis program and SLS as such tolerate? Let us remember that SLS was called into life back in 2010 in the 2010 Authorization Act, which had been called into life by US Congress. Before that, the Constellation program, which would have foreseen returning humans to the moon by 2019, had been cancelled by the Obama administration. But since that program was already pretty advanced, as much as possible had to be salvaged. The Orion capsule, for example, is a remnant from that program. The Ares series of rockets, which were under development, was kind of remodeled to incorporate as much legacy hardware as possible. So this Authorization Act enabled the back then brilliant sounding idea to use as much existing hardware as possible. Such was SLS created, to utilize as many parts as possible from the previous space programs. That's why SLS uses the very same Space Shuttle RS-25 main engines produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne. Although in a funny twist of fate, these engines wouldn't be reused with SLS, contrary to the Shuttle era, where they had actually been reused. The 2010 Authorization Act is also the reason why Northrop Grumman Space Shuttle solid rocket boosters are reintroduced, with the difference that they have been enhanced now with an additional segment, making them more powerful. Of course, the logic of reusing as much existing hardware as possible was not a stupid idea, while at the same time keeping all the people working for the contractors employed. It's no wonder then that SLS gathered a lot of support from senators who had Boeing, Northrop, or Aerojet Rocketdyne facilities in their state. Most famously, of course, Alabama Republican Senator Richard Shelby became an ardent proponent of SLS. No wonder, since Boeing, Northrop, and Aerojet Rocketdyne, and even Lockheed with their Orion capsule, all have production facilities in Huntsville, Alabama.
So actually this should be perfect, right? Having all these aerospace companies together in one city, working together, reusing old hardware. This should have been the perfect setup for SLS, right? But unfortunately we know that it didn't turn out that way. Last year, NASA's Inspector General found that the SLS program had faced many delays and cost overruns of at least 33% over the intended Congress-approved baseline of $7 billion. Up to a whopping $9.6 billion. And this doesn't even include the costs for other hardware such as Orion or the mobile launchers, which also had to be remodeled for SLS. And the Inspector General found that this number will rise to 43%, so well over $10 billion, should the Artemis 1 flight be pushed beyond November 2021, which now seems increasingly likely. The question now that arises is, of course, what will happen if Artemis 1 is pushed back well into 2022, or if a more major problem is found with the RS-25 engine, which could mean Artemis 1 in late 2022, especially now with the new administration soon taking over. Jim Bridenstine will step down on Wednesday, January 20th, and NASA will get a new administrator at some point this year. Also, there are strong indications already that spaceflight and space exploration aren't exactly very high on the agenda of the new administration in this time of global pandemic. So in our opinion, we have two major scenarios. The first one, SLS gets lucky and the hotfire test can be repeated next month, because it turns out to be a minor issue with the engine. Then it can be shipped to the Kennedy Space Center and we can have SLS launch the Orion capsule on that unmanned flight around the moon in November 2021. Or it turns out to be a bigger issue which would get the SLS into serious trouble. With all these delays and even higher cost overruns, SLS could come under scrutiny, especially since Senator Richard Shelby, the biggest supporter of SLS, has recently lost his chair in the upcoming session of Congress, greatly diminishing his power to garner support for the SLS. More resistance towards SLS could mount. And this resistance would of course be greatly increased if other launch systems can demonstrate that they could do a better job for less money. Thus, a lot also depends on SpaceX. SpaceX has basically completely taken over NASA's human spaceflight from the old contractors such as Boeing. Boeing doesn't only build the SLS, but also the Starliner, and we remember that they lost to SpaceX's Crew Dragon. SpaceX is now routinely sending astronauts to the ISS on the Falcon 9 and the Dragon capsule. Should SLS get delayed by a year, we could, with a bit of luck, see Starship making the first orbital flight before SLS gets off the ground. This would certainly already send a strong message to Congress. With a bit more luck, we could see the first orbital test flight of Starship and Super Heavy by the end of this year, and the first uncrewed lunar round trip of a Starship in 2022. If Starship would demonstrate deep space capability and a safe return to Earth in an unmanned moon round trip, this would send an even stronger signal to all supporters of SLS.
We think that in that scenario, support for SLS would break away rapidly, and a cancellation of SLS might happen faster than many thought, thus being replaced by Starship, a fully reusable launch system that can send more payload to the moon and to other destinations than SLS ever could. While SLS could have landed human landers, such as the Dynetics Alpaca or the National Team's lander on the surface of the moon, Starship can land over 100 metric tons of cargo there, complete with a pretty gigantic interior volume of 1,000 cubic meters. So maybe all this is actually a good thing. From every seemingly bad event, something good can arise. While it's too early to say for sure what consequences this failed Green Run hotfire test will have, now we can already feel that the time for another paradigm shift in human spaceflight is not far away anymore. And that if events unfold in a certain way, we could see SpaceX taking over yet another branch from the old contractors, namely crewed flights to the moon.
And if you missed our last episode where we talked about the current status of Starship and Blue Origin, you can watch it right here.
So thanks for watching the JI Space Report, and I would say, on to the future.
Yeah. You can say something?
Ja, sind wir voll dabei?
Test.
The famous test recording.